wife, her boss, a neighbor, and a private detective. A night that changed everything. Declan Reed was returning home after a long business trip. Over the past 2 weeks, he had signed several important contracts, met new clients, and built ambitious plans for his company. But his mind was far from work. He dreamed of coming home, hugging his wife Alice, and spending a quiet evening together discussing everything that had happened while he was away. As he approached the station, Declan felt a familiar warmth, the anticipation of seeing a loved one. He stepped off the train, pulled up his hood against the chilly evening air, and paused on the platform, searching for a taxi. At that moment, he saw her. Alice was standing by a white Rolls-Royce, arms crossed, cautiously looking around. She looked incredibly elegant. A black dress emphasized her figure, and red lipstick gave her an air of mystery. But what made Declan freeze wasn't her appearance. It was the man standing next to her. Tall, dressed in an expensive suit, with a confident demeanor. The man was the embodiment of success. He opened the car door, and Alice got inside as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Declan held his breath. He immediately recognized the man. Harry St. Clair, the CEO of the company where Alice worked. Declan had heard about him many times, but had never seen him in person. What were they doing together? And why was Alice getting into his car? He raised his hand, as if to call out to her, but hesitated at the last second. A thought flashed through his mind. What if it's just work-related? What if she hasn't done anything wrong? But at the same moment, he felt a tightness in his chest, a strange feeling he couldn't ignore. Declan decided to act. He quickly flagged down a taxi and asked the driver to follow the white Rolls-Royce. The car glided smoothly out of the station, and Declan carefully observed its every move. "Something serious, mister?" the driver asked, glancing in the rearview mirror. "Just a personal matter," Declan replied curtly, not wanting to go into detail. The taxi followed the sedan, weaving through the city's evening traffic. Declan watched as the car turned onto a street leading toward the city center. But suddenly, traffic grew heavier, and they got stuck in a jam. The white sedan quickly disappeared around the corner, leaving Declan in confusion. "Damn," he muttered, clenching his fists. "Don't worry, mister. Maybe they'll circle back," the driver tried to reassure him, but Declan just stared grimly out the window. When he finally got home, Alice was already there. She was sitting in the living room with a glass of wine, watching television. Her face radiated calm, as if nothing unusual had happened. "Hi, darling," she smiled when she saw him. "Hi," Declan replied, trying to hide his unease. He approached her and kissed her on the cheek, inhaling the scent of her perfume. It was familiar, yet it seemed to have a different undertone, a foreign one. "How was your trip?" Alice asked, watching him with her large blue eyes. "Fine, a lot of work," he said, sitting on the couch beside her. "And you? What's new?" Alice hesitated slightly but then answered, "Nothing special. Work, home, the usual." Her response seemed too simple, almost automatic. But Declan didn't press further. His mind was already spinning with questions. That night, he couldn't sleep. The thoughts of what he had seen at the station kept haunting him. Who was Harry St. Clair to Alice? Why was she with him? Was there something more than a professional relationship? Declan stared at the ceiling, searching for answers. But instead, he found only one thought. He needed to find out the truth. Declan woke up early. His sleep had been restless, fragmented, and it felt like he hadn't rested at all. Something gnawed at him, an invisible weight pressing on his chest. He couldn't get the image of Alice in that white sedan with Harry St. Clair out of his mind. The sense of unease grew stronger by the minute. He decided to go for a morning run, hoping physical activity would clear his head. But even in the park, as he covered mile after mile, thoughts of Alice and Harry wouldn't leave him. Declan realized he had to act, but he didn't know where to start. When he returned home, a surprise awaited him on the doorstep. Declan bent down and picked up the small envelope waiting for him at his front door. There were no markings or inscriptions, just his name written in neat handwriting with black ink. Quickly glancing around, he noticed the street was empty. Inside the envelope was a small note. "You don't know who you're living with. If you want the truth, meet me today at 7 p.m. at the Café Moonlight Night. Come alone." Declan's hand trembled as he read the note several times. Someone knew what was troubling him. But who? And could they be trusted? He stepped inside and carefully tucked the note into his pocket. Alice was in the kitchen, preparing breakfast. Her demeanor was carefree, even cheerful, which only intensified the contrast with the storm brewing in Declan's mind. "Had a good run?" she asked without looking up from the skillet. "Yeah," he replied curtly, trying to mask his nervousness. "What are you making?" "Omelette. I figured you'd be hungry after your trip and the run." Declan sat at the table, watching her movements. She looked so familiar, so domestic, but that only deepened his inner conflict. How could this woman, now making him breakfast, be the same one he had seen last night? As the clock neared 7 p.m., Declan grew increasingly anxious. He decided not to tell Alice and came up with an excuse to leave the house. "I have a meeting with a client," he said, putting on his jacket. "In the evening?" she asked, surprised. "Yeah," they insisted. "Seems like they want to discuss a new contract." Alice nodded, but Declan noticed a flicker of something in her eyes. Surprise, or perhaps suspicion. The Café Moonlight Night was a small, cozy place in the old part of town. Closed since the 80s, it retained a retro vibe with soft lighting and dark wood furniture. Declan walked in and quickly scanned the room. In a far corner sat a woman. She looked familiar, but he couldn't immediately recall from where. She gestured for him to sit at her table. "Declan Reed?" she asked in a quiet voice. "Yes, that's me. And you are?" "Vivian Gray," she introduced herself, extending a hand. Declan paused. Vivian was their neighbor. She lived across the street and seemed ordinary, if not unremarkable. They rarely interacted, and he certainly hadn't imagined her being involved in something like this. "What's all this about?" Declan asked, staring directly at her. Vivian leaned back in her chair and sighed softly. "It's hard for me to say this, but I've long suspected something is wrong with your wife. I've seen things I can't ignore." "Like what?" "Like Harry St. Clair. He's been at your house multiple times when you weren't there. I've seen them go into the house together, and trust me, it didn't look like a regular work visit." Declan felt his heart begin to race. Maybe it's just work? Maybe, but there's more. "A few times, I've heard voices at night. Sometimes they sounded like arguments, and other times, something else." Declan clenched his jaw, trying to maintain his composure. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I know how much it hurts. I've been through something similar, and I don't want anyone else to go through it." She handed him a few photographs. They showed Alice and Harry standing near the house, laughing together. In one of the photos, Alice had her hand on Harry's shoulder. "I thought you should see these," Vivian said. Declan remained silent, his thoughts spinning around what he had just seen and heard. Vivian seemed sincere, but could she be trusted? And more importantly, what should he do now? "Thank you," he finally said. I'll think about what to do." Vivian nodded. "Take care, Declan. You deserve to know the truth." He left the cafe, feeling a mix of anger and anxiety growing inside him. The truth he had been seeking was starting to reveal itself, but it was far worse than he had imagined. Now, the pressing question loomed. How should he act next? As Declan walked home, his heart felt heavy. The city around him was alive with energy. Music played in the cafes, couples strolled along the sidewalks, and the glow of streetlights illuminated the streets. But for Declan, the world felt dark and uncertain. He was stepping into a reality he wasn't prepared for. The reflections in the windows of nearby houses seemed distant and unreal. Declan's world was crumbling, leaving only anger and uncertainty. What he heard and saw at the cafe felt like a stone sinking into the depths of his soul. Declan tried to convince himself that it might be a mistake. Vivian could be exaggerating, or the photos might have been innocent moments taken out of context. But deep down, he knew these were just excuses. The truth was too obvious. When he entered the house, Alice was sitting on the couch with her laptop on her lap. She looked relaxed, as if nothing in the world could disturb her. "How was the meeting?" she asked without even looking up. "Pretty productive," Declan replied, trying to sound casual. He tossed his keys on the table and headed to the kitchen to pour himself a glass of water. Watching Alice through the open doorway, he felt his anger rising. Her carefree demeanor felt almost mocking. "What are you working on?" he asked, attempting to start a normal conversation. "Reviewing reports for tomorrow's meeting," she replied, not taking her eyes off the screen. Declan nodded, though he wasn't sure she noticed. His thoughts were consumed with how to find out more without revealing his suspicions. The next morning, after Alice left for work, Declan decided to take action. He knew searching her belongings was a violation of trust, but he convinced himself it was necessary to uncover the truth. First, he checked her phone. Nothing suspicious. No messages that raised any red flags. But this didn't surprise him. Alice had always been careful, and if she was hiding something, she wouldn't leave evidence in plain sight. Next, he turned to her laptop. He knew the password. They had shared it before, and, after entering it, he gained access to her desktop. Declan began sifting through folders, hoping to find something that would confirm or dispel his doubts. After a few minutes, he stumbled upon a folder labeled Personal. His heart raced as he opened it. Inside were photos, most of them ordinary family pictures. But one photo stopped him cold. In the photo, Alice and Harry were sitting in a restaurant. Both looked relaxed and happy. Her hand rested on his, and it wasn't the gesture of a colleague or friend. It was something more. Declan felt blood rush to his head. He closed the laptop and froze in silence for a moment. His suspicions were turning into certainty. But now, a new question arose. How deep did this relationship go? And how long had it been happening? Declan decided to hire a private investigator. He knew uncovering the full truth on his own would be challenging and needed professional help. Later that day, he got the contact information for a private detective from a friend. When Declan called, the man on the other end introduced himself as Ryan West, an experienced investigator specializing in family matters. "What do you want to know?" Ryan asked in a calm, confident voice. "I need evidence. Something to confirm or disprove my suspicions about my wife," Declan replied. "Are you prepared for what you might find out?" Ryan's tone turned slightly more serious. "Yes. I need to know the truth, no matter what it is." They arranged to meet the next day, and Declan felt he had taken the right step. He was no longer alone in this chaos. That evening, Declan acted as though everything was normal. He laughed at Alice's jokes, discussed weekend plans, and even helped her with dinner. But inside, he was already forming a plan. From now on, every conversation, every glance, every gesture would be a clue in a complex puzzle. Lying in bed, Declan stared at the ceiling for a long time. She was sleeping beside him, breathing evenly and peacefully as if nothing had happened. But for him, this was the night his life had changed forever. The next day, Declan met Ryan West in a small office in the city center. Ryan was a man in his 40s with piercing eyes and close-cropped hair. His calm confidence immediately gave Declan a sense of hope. "Tell me everything you know," Ryan began, motioning for Declan to take a seat. Declan pulled the photos Vivian had given him from his bag and briefly recounted his suspicions, the conversation with his neighbor, and what he had found on Alice's laptop. Ryan listened attentively, occasionally jotting down notes. "All right," Ryan said when Declan finished. "I'll start by keeping an eye on your wife. If there's anything you've missed, I'll find it." "How long will it take?" Declan asked. "It depends on the circumstances, but usually a few weeks is enough." Declan nodded, though his impatience was obvious. He understood it was a process but wanted answers as soon as possible. When Declan returned home, he tried to act as if nothing had happened. Alice seemed completely unaware. She was just as caring and warm as always, but now every gesture she made seemed suspicious to Declan. Over the next few days, Ryan regularly sent Declan brief updates on the progress of the investigation. At first, nothing unusual happened. Alice went to work, met with colleagues, and returned home. But everything changed a few days later. One evening, as Declan was about to go to bed, his phone lit up. It was a message from Ryan. "Your wife just met Harry St. Clair at a restaurant. They appear to have a close relationship. I took some photos. See for yourself." Attached to the message were pictures. They showed Alice and Harry sitting at a small table in a cozy restaurant. Their faces were close to one another, and their expressions were far too intimate for mere colleagues. In one photo, Harry was touching her hand. Declan felt his anger boiling. His suspicions were being confirmed, and it was almost unbearable. But along with the anger came another feeling, determination. He decided he wouldn't let her destroy their life without consequences. The next day, Declan called Ryan to discuss the next steps. "I need to know everything," Declan said. "Not just about Harry. If there's anyone else or anything else she's hiding, I have to know." Ryan agreed and promised to dig deeper. Meanwhile, Declan began noticing little things that he had previously overlooked. For instance, how Alice always kept her phone with her, even when she went to the bathroom, or how she sometimes received messages and deleted them immediately, thinking he didn't notice. One evening, when Alice once again claimed she was working late, Declan decided to check if it was true. He called Ryan, who confirmed that Alice wasn't at work. She was at a nightclub with Harry. This revelation was the final straw for Declan. He could wait no longer. "Ryan," he said over the phone, "I want to meet with you tomorrow. I have a plan." The next day, they met at the same office. Ryan brought new evidence, photographs, bank statements, and even a recording of a conversation between Alice and Harry that he had obtained through surveillance. "This is everything I need," Declan said as he reviewed the materials. "What are you planning to do?" Ryan asked, his voice filled with curiosity. "I can't tell you that, but thank you for your help." Declan returned home with the evidence in hand. He knew he now had everything to expose Alice, but he also understood that his actions needed to be carefully planned. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about restoring justice and regaining control over his life. When Alice came home that night, she was in a cheerful mood. "How was your day?" she asked, kissing him on the cheek. Declan smiled, but inside he felt nothing but cold. "All good," he said. "How about you?" "Busy but productive. I'm glad tomorrow's a day off." She went to the bathroom while Declan remained in his chair, holding the folder of evidence. He knew everything was about to change, but now he was ready. The following morning, Declan reviewed the notes and materials he had received from Ryan and realized he needed more professional assistance. That evening, he met Ryan again, this time in a quiet cafe, to discuss the next steps. Ryan, as always, appeared calm and confident. He listened attentively to Declan, occasionally jotting down notes in his notebook. "What exactly do you want to find out?" Ryan asked, looking directly at Declan. Declan paused for a few moments before answering, his voice filled with determination. "I need more information about Harry St. Clair. Who he is, what he does, and what connections he has. I want to know what he's planning with Alice." Ryan nodded, flipping through his notes. St. Clair is a well-known figure in the business world. He runs a large company that deals with investments and real estate. However, as far as I know, he has a dark side. He's been suspected of fraud multiple times, but there's never been enough evidence. I can start investigating his business contacts and see if there's anything useful for you. "Good," Declan agreed. "But the main thing is his connection with Alice. I want to know why she's involved in this and what role Vivian plays in all of this." Ryan noticed the shift in Declan's tone. He could see the internal struggle the man was going through and decided to proceed cautiously. "To begin with, I can arrange surveillance on St. Clair. We'll find out who he meets, the places he frequents, and how he behaves outside of work. This might help us gather more information about his plans. I'll also think about discreet ways to investigate Vivian without arousing her suspicion." Declan sighed and rubbed his temples. It was hard for him to accept how much intrigue and secrecy had suddenly invaded his life. "How long could this take?" he asked. "A few days, maybe a week. It depends on how cautious they are." Declan nodded, realizing he didn't have another choice. He knew this investigation could provide answers to the questions tormenting him, but he also understood the truth could be painful. After meeting with Ryan, Declan returned home. The night was quiet, and the city seemed to be holding its breath. Alice was already asleep, her face calm and serene. Declan stood at the bedroom door, staring at her for a long time. He tried to figure out what had gone wrong in their relationship. She had been everything to him, his friend, partner, and the love of his life. But now a wall of distrust and suspicion stood between them. The next day, Ryan got to work. He organized surveillance on Harry St. Clair, involving several of his team members. They tracked his every move, taking photos, recording videos, and gathering information about his meetings. For the first few days, nothing suspicious happened. St. Clair behaved like an ordinary businessman, meeting with colleagues and attending meetings. But on the fourth day, something changed. Ryan informed Declan that St. Clair had dinner at an exclusive restaurant with a few people, including Alice. They sat at a private table in a secluded area, and their conversation seemed tense. One of Ryan's agents managed to record part of their discussion. When Declan listened to the recording, his heart sank. Alice was discussing the details of a contract, using terms unfamiliar to him. But it wasn't the content of her words that unsettled him. It was the way she spoke. There was confidence and determination in her voice he had never noticed before. She sounded like a completely different person. Declan analyzed what he had heard, trying to understand what Alice was hiding. His thoughts revolved around one question. Why had Alice changed so much, and what had driven her to this? Meanwhile, Ryan continued his investigation. He started looking for connections between St. Clair and Vivian, but had yet to uncover anything concrete. However, one of his agents discovered something that might explain Alice's behavior. A small property in the suburbs registered in her name. Ryan passed this information to Declan, who decided to check it out. That evening, when Alice said she would be working late, Declan drove to the address provided. It was a small house tucked away among trees. A light was on in one of the windows, and Declan saw silhouettes of people inside. His heart began to race. Who were they? What was happening there? Declan decided not to act impulsively. He took several photos of the house, recorded the address, and returned home. His mind was full of speculation, but he knew he didn't have enough evidence to draw conclusions. The next day, he met with Ryan to share his observations. Ryan promised to investigate the property and identify who was visiting it. Declan began to feel the tangled threads of this mystery slowly unraveling. But along with that came a new emotion, fear of what he might discover. He understood the truth could change everything, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for that. Carter Black didn't waste time. As an experienced detective, he understood that every detail could be critical in a case like this. After his first meeting with Declan, he assembled his team and got to work. Declan handed over all the materials he had: photos, recordings, suspicious documents, and his theories about the possible connections between Alice, Harry St. Clair, and their neighbor, Vivian. Carter knew this case would require meticulous attention to detail. Over the next few days, Carter focused on Harry St. Clair. He examined his business dealings, meetings, habits, and even his private life. Despite his status as a successful businessman, Harry had a reputation for knowing how to skirt the law. His company had been implicated in questionable deals multiple times, but he always managed to come out unscathed. Evidence seemed to vanish, and witnesses frequently changed their stories. Carter discovered that Harry had ties to several prominent attorneys specializing in out-of-court settlements. His name also appeared in documents related to land and real estate schemes, though none of these incidents ever led to criminal charges. Carter decided to dig deeper into Harry's social circle. One of the first suspicious individuals was a woman who visited Harry's office almost daily. Initially, Carter assumed she was his assistant, but later he learned she served a different role. She was a financial consultant managing Harry's assets. Her connection with him extended beyond professional boundaries. In one photograph taken by Carter's team, she was seen holding Harry's hand as they left a restaurant. Declan received the first results of the investigation and was stunned. Carter handed him several photos showing Alice sitting at a restaurant table with Harry and another woman Declan instantly recognized, Vivian. The photos showed them conversing, exchanging looks that clearly indicated something more than just a friendly discussion. Carter also provided several documents. One of them was a hotel booking signed by Alice. The room had been paid for with a card she used exclusively for personal expenses. Carter noted that the room had been visited multiple times by both Harry and Vivian. The information was shocking but still unclear enough to determine the true purpose of their meetings. Declan spent an hour examining the photographs and documents. His mind was flooded with thoughts that gave him no peace. He started recalling the small details from the past few months, how Alice had suddenly changed her style, stayed late at work more often, and acted as though she was hiding something important. Carter continued the investigation. He discovered that Harry St. Clair had been hosting a series of private meetings at his countryside estate. Guests would arrive at night, and these didn't seem like typical business gatherings. Most of the attendees had criminal records or dubious reputations. One meeting drew particular attention. Carter found out that both Alice and Vivian were present. This led him to suspect that they were both involved in some complex plan. While he couldn't yet determine exactly what they were planning, it was clear that this was about more than just personal relationships. Carter shared his findings with Declan, whose anger and anxiety only grew. He was no longer in doubt. Alice was betraying him, emotionally and physically. But now he wanted to know what lay behind this betrayal. Was it merely a personal matter, or was Alice involved in something illegal? Declan decided to act. He asked Carter to continue the surveillance while also gathering information on his own. His first step involved reviewing their family finances. Declan noticed that over the past few months, Alice had been making significant expenditures that didn't match her income. She had purchased expensive jewelry and clothing and paid bills at restaurants and clubs that Declan had never visited. The biggest surprise came when he discovered she had rented a premium car that he didn't even know about. Meanwhile, Carter took the investigation to a new level. He found that Vivian had been working closely with Harry long before Declan started suspecting his wife. Vivian was involved in finding potential clients for Harry and helping him resolve conflicts. Carter suspected that she might be acting as a middleman between Harry and his less legitimate partners. Declan felt the truth drawing closer. He gathered all the materials provided by Carter and began planning his next steps. He needed more evidence to expose Alice's true intentions and her connections to Harry. Declan knew he was taking a risk, but it was the only way to regain control over his life. Carter, meanwhile, prepared for the next phase of the investigation. He planned to infiltrate Harry's circle to learn more about his plans. Carter knew this could be dangerous, but was willing to take the risk to succeed. Declan spent the night deep in thought. The evidence, photographs, and documents lay spread out on the table before him. Like pieces of a giant puzzle, he had to assemble to see the full picture. He felt like a chess player strategizing against a seasoned opponent. But this game wasn't played on a board. It was happening in real life, and the stakes were far too high. Waking early, he reached out to Carter and requested a face-to-face meeting. Carter arrived within an hour, holding a new folder of evidence. His focused expression suggested he also felt they were nearing a critical moment in the case. "We've made progress," Carter said as he sat across from Declan. "I've learned that there's going to be a private meeting at Harry St. Clair's house tonight. This is important. Alice will be there, and not just her." Declan leaned in, listening intently. "Who else?" he asked, his voice tense with anticipation. "Harry, of course. Vivian. And two other individuals I haven't been able to identify yet. But my sources say this isn't just a friendly dinner. They'll be discussing something with serious implications for St. Clair's business." "And Alice?" Declan asked, barely able to contain his anger. Carter sighed. "She's involved. It seems she's helping Harry gather information about your business dealings. They're looking for weaknesses they can use against you." Declan clenched his teeth, feeling a surge of rage. But he also knew that letting his emotions take over could ruin everything. "I need to be there," he said after a pause. "I want to know what's going on." Carter shook his head. "It's too risky. If they see you, it will blow everything." "I have a plan," Declan said, his voice steady with conviction. "I don't want to just watch. I want to force them to make a mistake." Carter leaned forward, intrigued. "Tell me." Declan pulled out his phone and opened one of the schematics he had been working on for the past few days. "I know Harry's house," he began. "I've been there a few times for parties when Alice invited me early in her career at his company. There's an entrance they almost never use, and it leads directly to the kitchen. I can slip in unnoticed and set up a surveillance camera." Carter thought for a moment, analyzing the idea. "That could work. But we need a reason for you to be there without raising suspicion." Declan smiled. "I've already thought about that. I have an old courier uniform. I can pretend to be delivering a package for St. Clair." Carter stood and paced the room, considering the plan. "All right, it might work. But we'll need to ensure the camera is positioned to see and hear everything happening." I've got the equipment, Declan replied. It's small enough that no one will notice it. Carter nodded. Fine, then we'll do it. I'll be nearby to back you up. If anything goes wrong, I'll make sure you're safe. Declan spent the entire day preparing for the operation. He carefully planned each step, tested the equipment, and even practiced setting up the camera. That evening, standing in front of the mirror, he stared at his reflection. His face looked tired, but his eyes held determination. This is for the truth, he whispered to himself before leaving the house. When Declan arrived at Harry's house, the night had already fallen. The mansion looked elegant, its facade lit by soft lights, with warm light spilling from the windows. Declan knew something important was happening inside, and he needed to be as careful as possible. He pulled a cap low over his head and picked up a box marked Courier Service. Knocking on the door, he heard footsteps and muffled voices inside. One of Harry's security guards opened the door. "What do you want?" the guard asked, eyeing Declan suspiciously. "I have a delivery for Mr. St. Clair," Declan said, trying to sound confident. The guard inspected the box, then nodded and let him in. Declan entered the house, his heart pounding faster with every step. He slipped into the kitchen unnoticed and quickly installed the camera in a ventilation grate. After finishing, he returned to the guard. "All set," Declan said with a smile. "Have a good evening." He left the house as though nothing had happened, but inside, he felt he had accomplished something crucial. Now all that was left was to see what the camera would reveal. Carter met him in a nearby alley. "How did it go?" "Perfect," Declan replied. "The camera's in place. Now we'll know the truth." They quickly set up the equipment to stream the camera feed in real time. On the screen, the room came into view, showing the guests who had gathered. Declan recognized Alice, Harry, and Vivian. The two other men were unfamiliar to him, but their confident demeanor suggested they weren't ordinary guests. The conversation in the room started with general topics, but gradually shifted to something more serious. Declan and Carter listened intently, trying to make sense of what was being discussed. What they heard next was a shock. Alice was talking about Declan's financial operations, mentioning his clients and vulnerabilities in his business. It became clear she wasn't just betraying him as a wife, but was actively working against him, helping Harry find ways to undermine his company. Declan sat silently, staring at the screen, his heart clenched with pain, but he knew this was only the beginning. The camera showed Alice smiling at Harry, while Vivian added her comments as though it were all part of some twisted game. Carter placed a reassuring hand on Declan's shoulder. "Hang in there. We're close." Declan nodded, his eyes never leaving the screen. He knew this night would change everything, but he was ready for whatever came next. The game had truly begun. Declan held the tablet streaming the footage from the hidden camera. His heart pounded, and every second of tense anticipation felt like an eternity. He felt a lump forming in his throat, but couldn't afford to lose control. His plan had worked, and now all he could do was watch what was happening inside Harry St. Clair's house. The camera provided a clear view of the room where Alice, Harry, Vivian, and two other men had gathered. One of the men looked like a typical businessman. An expensive suit, a watch worth more than a mid-range car, and a cold, calculating gaze. The other appeared more casual, almost nonchalant in his behavior, but Declan immediately sensed it was a facade. His gestures revealed confidence and control. The conversation turned increasingly intense, with the group discussing strategies that made it evident they were plotting something significant. Declan's grip on the tablet tightened as he watched his wife, the woman he once trusted completely, betray him in real time. "We need to move faster," Harry said, his intense gaze fixed on Alice. "We can't afford any delays. Competitors are already catching wind of our plans." Alice nodded, her hands folded neatly on the table. She appeared calm, but Declan noticed something unfamiliar in her eyes, an intensity he had never seen before. "I've done everything I can to access Declan's accounts," she said, "but he's very cautious. All his key transactions go through multiple layers of security. It's going to take time to break through." Declan felt his blood boil. She wasn't just betraying him. She was actively working to dismantle his business, his reputation, everything he had spent years building. But he forced himself to stay focused. He needed more information. There's no time, interrupted the man in the suit. If we want this to work, we need to act now. I've already prepared a contract for a fake stock purchase in his company. If everything goes according to plan, we can transfer the money to offshore accounts, and he won't even realize what's happened. What if he gets suspicious? Vivian asked, sipping her wine. Her voice was indifferent, but her eyes burned with interest. We have leverage, Harry replied calmly. We know about his weak spots. For instance, his partner in London, the one who isn't exactly playing by the rules. If Declan tries to resist, we'll make that information public. Alice smiled faintly. Declan has another weakness. He trusts people too much. That's always been his problem. Her words cut through Declan like a knife. She spoke about him with such cold detachment, as if he were merely an obstacle in her way. At that moment, the other man, the one who had been behaving casually, pulled a phone from his pocket and showed something to Harry. Declan couldn't see the screen, but Harry's reaction was telling. His face tensed, and he began reading intently. This is interesting, Harry said after a few seconds. It looks like we have another opportunity. This document confirms that Declan is planning a deal with a European company. If we interfere now, we can convince them to back out of the partnership. Alice leaned forward, peering at the screen. This could work. They're highly sensitive to reputational risks. If we hint that Declan has legal troubles, they'll drop the deal. Harry nodded, swirling his wine glass in his hand. Good. Vivian, this will be your task. You know how to approach this. Vivian smiled, her grin cold and calculated. Leave it to me. Declan could feel his anger rising. He wanted to burst into the house and confront them all, to destroy their plan on the spot. But he knew it wouldn't help. He needed more evidence, more ammunition to expose them publicly. Everything is going according to plan, Harry concluded. If we do this right, he'll lose everything within a week. Alice raised her glass. To success. The others followed suit, the clinking of glasses echoing in the room. For them, it was a celebratory moment. For Declan, it was something else entirely, a challenge. He realized he couldn't wait any longer. It was time to strike back. As the feed ended, Carter turned to Declan. These are your people. What's the plan? Declan thought for a few seconds, his voice cold and resolute. We prepare. Their plan might seem well-crafted, but they've made one mistake. They underestimated me. Carter nodded. Then let's get to work. We don't have much time. Declan knew every minute counted. He was no longer the man who just watched. Now, he was a player determined to win this game at any cost. Declan sat in his car, staring at the tablet streaming the live footage. Suddenly, he noticed Alice's demeanor change. Her gestures became more relaxed, her glances at Harry more intimate. She smiled at him in a way that she used to smile only at Declan. It wasn't a professional smile or a polite one. It was something deeper. The evening's winding down, Harry said, looking at the others. Thank you for coming. But now, if you don't mind, I'd like to discuss a few details with Alice in private. Vivian and the two men nodded without question. They gathered their belongings and quickly left the room. Harry waited until the door closed behind them before turning to Alice. Finally, we're alone, he said, moving closer to her. You look stunning tonight. Alice laughed softly, lowering her eyes. You always know how to give a compliment, Harry. Only when it's deserved, he replied, his gaze fixed on her. Declan, watching through the camera, felt his hands begin to shake. He struggled to maintain control, but every word from Harry and every reaction from Alice caused him more pain. Harry reached out and gently touched her face. We've been working together for a long time, Alice, and I appreciate everything you've done for me. Alice didn't pull away. She looked at him, and in her eyes, Declan saw something he hadn't seen in years. You know this is important to me, she replied, her voice softer. It's not just business, Harry continued, leaning in closer. You're important to me. Alice didn't respond but didn't push him away either. Their faces were so close there was no space left between them. Then Harry leaned in and kissed her. Declan clenched his teeth, trying not to scream. His heart was breaking, and his mind raced to find an explanation for what he was witnessing. But there was no excuse. Alice didn't push Harry away, nor did she say anything to stop him. Instead, she responded to his kiss. The moment lasted only seconds, but for Declan, it felt like an eternity. 100 questions flooded his mind. How long had this been going on? Why was she doing this? Had he ever truly known her? Harry pulled back slightly, looking into her eyes. "We could be so much more than just partners, Alice," he said. Alice smiled. "Aren't we already?" Their conversation continued, but for Declan, everything was now clear. His wife hadn't just betrayed him. She had chosen Harry's side, not only in business but in life. The truth was excruciating, but it gave him what he needed. The resolve to end this game once and for all. Declan turned off the tablet. His plan was evolving. This wasn't just a fight for his business anymore. It was a fight for justice. He decided he wouldn't let them win. Declan returned home late that night, his heart overwhelmed with emotions that were hard to describe. Pain, anger, disappointment. He closed the door as if trying to shut out the memory of what he had just seen. But the image of Alice kissing Harry remained vivid in his mind. Her betrayal wasn't just personal. It was symbolic. She had destroyed not only their marriage, but also the trust he had placed in her. Sitting in the dark, Declan began forming a plan. He knew the time for open action had come. There was no longer any point in waiting or gathering more evidence. Everything was clear. Alice and Harry were working together, and their goal was evident, to destroy him. But now Declan had an advantage. He knew their plans, and that gave him a chance to change the game. The next morning, Declan contacted Carter. They met in a small park, far from prying eyes and ears. Carter looked concerned but confident. "We have all the evidence we need," Carter began as he sat next to Declan on the bench. "We could take this to the police, but there's a risk. If they find out you've interfered in their dealings, it could backfire on you." Declan nodded. "I understand, but I'm not just going to sit and watch them destroy everything I've built. I have another plan." Carter listened attentively as Declan laid out his thoughts. He wanted to use the evidence they had gathered to set a trap. Declan knew Harry and Alice felt invincible, which made them careless. That would be their weakness. "They think I don't know anything," Declan said, "and that's my advantage. If we can make them slip up, it'll be the end of their game." Carter agreed. "All right, what do you propose?" "Harry plans to sabotage my deal with the European company," Declan explained. "We'll use that. I'll give them what they want, but in a form that exposes their true intentions." Over the next few days, Declan and Carter worked together to create a fake contract and supporting documents. They made sure everything looked convincing. The contract outlined Declan's willingness to sell part of his business, but it was carefully designed with legal traps. Declan knew the stakes were high, but he was ready. This wasn't just about reclaiming what was his. It was about justice and ensuring Harry and Alice couldn't harm anyone else. Declan also prepared technical equipment to record every step they took. Everything had to be documented: conversations, documents, and actions. He wanted airtight evidence, leaving no room for excuses. When everything was ready, Declan invited Alice to dinner. She accepted, but her demeanor was reserved. They sat at the table, talking about mundane topics, but Declan noticed her glancing nervously at her phone from time to time. "You look tired," he said, trying to sound caring. "Just a lot of work," Alice replied with a smile. Declan observed her with a mix of emotions. She was still the woman he had once loved, yet she had become a stranger to him. Her words, smiles, and even her gestures seemed like part of an elaborate performance. After dinner, he left a folder of documents on the table. "This is what I've been working on for the past few days," he said. "It's critical for our business." Alice glanced at the folder with interest. "What is it?" "A deal with European partners," Declan replied. "But I want to make sure everything is perfect before signing." Alice nodded, her eyes lighting up with curiosity. "I'm sure you'll nail it." "I hope so," Declan said, looking directly into her eyes. He knew she would pass the documents to Harry. This was the pivotal moment in his plan. The next morning, Carter informed Declan that Alice had met with Harry and handed him the folder. Harry immediately involved his legal team to review it, but as expected, they failed to notice the trap. "They took the bait," Carter said, reviewing the footage. "Now we just have to wait." Declan felt a mix of triumph and anxiety. His plan was in motion, But he knew this was just the first step. The coming days would determine everything. When Harry signed the fake contract and began acting on it, Declan assembled a team of lawyers and journalists. He prepared a press conference where he intended to expose not only Harry but Alice as well. That evening, as everyone gathered in the conference hall, Declan stood before the cameras, holding the documents that exposed Harry's conspiracy. Alice, seated among the audience, looked stunned. She realized their plan had failed, and now she would have to answer for her actions. This was the moment of truth. Declan knew there was no turning back. But he also knew he was doing the right thing to reclaim control over his life. Declan stood in his apartment, reviewing the materials Carter had gathered throughout the investigation. His mind raced, piecing together the final plan for the exposé. He understood that there was no room for error now. Everything had to go perfectly to ensure Harry, Alice, and their accomplices faced the consequences. Early in the morning, Carter called with news. He had discovered that Harry was hosting another meeting at his house that evening, this time with other influential individuals in attendance. It was an opportunity too good to miss. They're planning to discuss the final phase of their plan, Carter said over the phone. If we can record this, we'll have evidence even Harry's best lawyers can't refute. Declan nodded, even though Carter couldn't see him. He felt his anxiety mixing with adrenaline. This was the moment everything would be decided. I'm ready, he said. What's your plan? Carter outlined it briefly. They would use the recording equipment Declan had previously deployed but add live surveillance to the setup. Carter would remain near Harry's house, monitoring the events, while Declan stayed safe, controlling the operation remotely. The key is not to intervene too early, Carter warned. They can't even suspect we're watching. Only then can we get the most out of this. Declan agreed. He knew this was their last chance to gather the necessary evidence. That evening, as the city descended into darkness, Carter positioned himself near Harry's house. He chose a spot with a clear view of the entrance and much of the living room through the large windows. Declan sat at home, watching the live feed from the hidden cameras on his monitor. Guests began arriving around 8 p.m. Carter noted well-dressed men and women entering the house, their faces serious, their brief conversations indicating they weren't there for leisure. Alice was the first to arrive. She wore an elegant dark green dress that accentuated her figure. Declan felt his heart tighten, but kept his composure. Behind her, Harry entered, exuding his usual confidence and authority. They exchanged a few words before turning their attention to the other guests. Declan knew this night was pivotal. Everything he and Carter had worked for hinged on what they would capture. Watching Alice and Harry greet the guests, he felt a surge of determination. This wasn't just about reclaiming his business. It was about restoring his dignity and exposing the truth. As the meeting began, Carter signaled to Declan, "It's starting. Let's get everything." Carter listened intently through the headphones connected to the microphones they had planted earlier. The conversation started casually, but gradually shifted in tone. The guests began discussing business deals, financial maneuvers, and ways to bypass the law. "We have everything we need to close this deal," Harry said, addressing the group. "Tomorrow, I'll sign the documents, and by the end of the week, all the financial matters will be settled." "What about Declan?" one of the guests asked, lighting a cigar. "Could he still be a problem?" Harry smirked. "His time is up. He has no idea how close he is to losing everything. Alice has done an excellent job, and now we have everything we need to control the situation." Alice nodded, looking pleased. Her cold confidence tore at Declan's insides, but he forced himself to keep listening. "If we execute this correctly," Harry continued, "in a month, his company will be ours. We have all the leverage we need to make him sign exactly what we want." "And if he resists?" asked a woman seated next to Harry. "We have a plan B," he replied calmly. "I have contacts who will help persuade him." Declan understood what that meant. Harry was willing to use any means necessary, including threats or even violence, to achieve his goals. Carter noticed one of the guests walking to the window and glancing outside. He held his breath, but the man returned to the conversation without suspecting anything. "They're laying all their cards on the table," Carter whispered through the headset. "We're almost there." Declan nodded, even though Carter couldn't see him. He listened carefully, making sure not to miss a word. Suddenly, one of the previously silent guests spoke up. What if information about this operation reaches the police or journalists? Are you sure everything is well hidden? Harry waved dismissively. We have people to manage those issues. No one will find out unless we want them to. This was exactly what Declan needed. Direct confirmation of the conspiracy, a willingness to break the law, and their confidence in their impunity. Carter, Declan whispered, we've got everything. Let's move. Carter silently nodded and sprang into action. He called the police, providing the house's location and a brief description of the illegal activities taking place. Simultaneously, he compiled all the recordings and prepared to send them to journalists. This was the pivotal moment, the exposé that would bring the dangerous game to an end. Declan stood in his office, reviewing the recordings and materials gathered over the past weeks. The sharp sting of betrayal and anger he'd felt initially had dulled. In its place was a steely resolve. He knew he had to act decisively and methodically. Harry and his team had lost the upper hand, but this was only the beginning. Carter called early that morning with major news. The police had officially opened an investigation into Harry St. Clair. The evidence was so damning that even Harry's powerful lawyers couldn't completely cover his tracks. We've made the first big move, Carter said. But Harry is still dangerous. He has connections and resources he can use to slip through this. I understand, Declan replied. But now he knows I won't stay silent. That changes the rules of the game. Declan decided the next step needed to be personal. He had to make Alice understand that she no longer had any power over him. He prepared evidence of her involvement in the conspiracy, including the recording where she explicitly discussed their plans against him with Harry. Alice was at home when Declan walked into the living room. Her face was calm, but Declan sensed that behind her mask lay anxiety and fear. We need to talk, he said, sitting across from her. Alice looked up, trying to maintain a facade of icy confidence. About what? She asked, her voice steady, though Declan noticed her hands gripping the fabric of the couch. About this, he said, placing a flash drive on the table. Alice stared at it silently before reaching out and inserting it into her laptop. As the recordings played, her face remained impassive. That's your voice, Declan said after a few moments of silence. You told Harry how to destroy me. Alice averted her eyes. I made you. Declan's voice was filled with outrage. I made you betray me? I made you work with the man who tried to take everything I built. Alice stayed silent. She knew there were no excuses left. I'll give you a chance to fix this, Declan continued. You'll help the police and tell them everything you know about Harry and his schemes. Otherwise, I'll use these recordings to destroy you the same way you tried to destroy me. Alice looked up at him, and for the first time in a long while, Declan saw something resembling fear in her eyes. What do you want me to do? She asked, her voice barely audible. Tell the truth, Declan said firmly. If you do, maybe you'll salvage something from what's left of your life. Alice agreed. She realized there was no point in resisting anymore. The next day, she met with the police and provided testimony that became a critical part of the investigation. Meanwhile, Declan focused on rebuilding his life. He held a series of meetings with key partners, assuring them that the company had not only survived the crisis but emerged stronger. His efforts paid off. The partners regained their trust, and the business began to flourish again. Harry, now facing multiple charges, tried to leverage his connections to evade accountability. But this time, it didn't work. The police uncovered more evidence of his illegal activities, and even his influential allies couldn't protect him. Declan watched the events unfold with quiet satisfaction. This was his victory, a hard-earned one, but worth every ounce of effort. Standing on the balcony of his new apartment, Declan gazed at the city lights. The air was cool, but the fresh sense of freedom and the resolution of his long battle warmed him from within. The past few months had left deep scars, but they had also opened new horizons. For the first time in a long while, he felt he could breathe freely. News of Harry St. Clair's arrest made headlines. Journalists tirelessly discussed his crimes, from financial fraud to blackmail and conspiracy. The investigation revealed numerous victims of Harry's schemes, and justice was finally within their reach. Vivian didn't escape punishment either. Her testimony against Harry was part of a deal that reduced her sentence but didn't absolve her completely. She left the city after the trial, disappearing from Declan's life forever. Alice also faced the consequences of her actions. Her involvement in the conspiracy was exposed, and while she avoided criminal charges due to her cooperation with investigators, her reputation was destroyed. She lost her job, her friends, and the trust of those who once supported her. After the divorce was finalized, she left the city, leaving Declan with a mix of relief and bitter regret. Restoring the business required immense effort from Declan. He spent long days meeting with partners, journalists, and lawyers, but the results were worth it. His company not only survived but grew stronger. Loyal employees who had stayed with him during the hardest times inspired him to keep moving forward. One evening, after a long day, Declan decided to visit a restaurant where he had once dined with Alice. Now, the place symbolized change for him. Sitting at a corner table, he ordered a glass of wine and allowed himself to relax for the first time in a while. The restaurant was bustling, but Declan found a moment to reflect. He thought about everything that had happened, the losses, the gains, and the lessons he had learned. A waitress approached, carrying a dessert he hadn't ordered. She smiled and said it was from another guest. Surprised, Declan looked in the direction she indicated and saw a woman sitting at a nearby table. She was unfamiliar, but her smile was warm and comforting. He raised his glass in gratitude, and for the first time, he felt his life beginning to return to normal. This encounter was just the beginning of a new chapter. Declan no longer feared trusting people, though he now approached it with greater caution. He had learned to discern true motives and to value honesty. His journey had been arduous, but he realized that the greatest challenges often open the door to new opportunities. The next day, Declan woke up feeling grateful. The past was behind him, and while it had brought pain, it had also made him stronger. He knew there were more challenges ahead, but he was ready. His story had ended, but his life was only just beginning. Imagine yourself in Declan's shoes. Would you be able to forgive such a betrayal, or would you use every resource to seek revenge? Perhaps you choose a third path? Share in the comments how you would handle this situation.